Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 1. We just finished up talking about how life is organized. When we talked about the organization of life, we said that we put a bunch of organelles together and we get cells. Let's talk more about a cell. A cell is the smallest thing that would be considered alive. Living things have to do those things that we talked about. They have to regulate. So a cell can regulate its internal environment. It can make molecules that it needs. It can break down things it doesn't need. A cell must, or can, and does, must, take in and use energy. Cells have to power the chemical reactions that take place inside of them, just like you have to take in food. Cells have to take food in as well. A cell has to be able to respond to its environment. Cells get told all the time, stop making this and start making that. I'm sure you've heard about cells. You knew about cells in high school and middle school. You talked about cells, but you probably never really talked about what cells do. Cells are little miniature factories. They make something. Each cell is different, or each group of cells, each kind of cell. Each kind of cell is different because each kind of cell makes something different. They have a different product that they make, or a different set of products that they make. And that's why we have liver cells, and why liver cells are different from stomach cells, and why stomach cells are different from muscle cells, and why nerve cells are different from nose cells. All these different cells have different products, different sets of products that they make. All cells get told often, stop making this, start making that. That's responding to their environment. Cells have to develop and maintain complex organization, making very specific proteins, making very specific molecules. That is developing and maintaining very complex organization. We'll talk about in Chapter 2, we'll talk a lot more about how proteins are organized. Proteins are very, very, very specific in how they have to be made. Proteins are very specific in how they have to be constructed. Cells reproduce. Cells make new cells. Again, how many cells were you the moment your life began? You were one single cell. How did I go from one cell to 37.2 trillion cells? The way that I did that is that one cell split in two. Those two cells reproduced and split to four. Those four reproduced and became 8. And keep doing and doing that math, and you get at 37.2 trillion cells. Cells do all of the things that we said living things have to be able to do. An individual cell does these things. You do these things. You reproduce. You reproduce new cells. Cells within your body are dying and have to be replaced. They get replaced. A cell, all cells have a membrane. All cells have a wrapper around them. All cells have a skin around them. Cells have to keep their internal environment separate from the external environment. Every living cell has a membrane around it, a wrapper around it. All living cells use DNA as their instructions for the products that they need to make. Every living thing, all living things, use DNA as their instructions. All things, all living things, are made of cells. All of those cells have a wrapper around them. These are the things that bind all life together. Everything's made of cells. All those cells have wrappers around them. All of those cells use DNA as their genetic information. There are two basic kinds of cells based on whether or not they have organelles. If they don't have an organelle, they're called a prokaryote. Pro means before. Kary, it literally translates to mean kernel, as in like a kernel of corn. That was the first name for the nucleus. When scientists first saw the nucleus inside of a cell, they didn't know what it was. All they saw was a little nugget inside of a cell, and they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what it did, so they called it the kernel, because it looked like a little nugget in there, little corn nugget. Kary literally means kernel, but we take it to mean nucleus because that was the first name for the nucleus, was the kernel. So prokaryote, ote just means representative of that group or individual within that group. So prokaryote, the word means before the nucleus. So these are all individuals that don't have a nucleus. Prokaryotes, bacteria. They were the first. They're the first living things on the planet. Before there was an animal, before there was a plant, there were bacteria. Prokaryotes are simpler. Remember, they don't have any organelles. Organelles are very highly ordered. Each organelle has a very different specific order. Prokaryotes don't have organelles. So they are therefore simpler. And because they don't need all this space for these organelles, they are smaller. Eukaryotes. There's two basic kinds of cells. The first are eukaryotes. The second is eukaryotes. Eu means true or good. Kary still means kernel. So eukaryotes, eukaryotic cells, are cells that have a true nucleus. Two kinds of cells, prokaryotes, eukaryotes. Eukaryotic cells are what plants have. They're what animals have. They're what fungi have. And another group called protists that we'll talk about a lot later on. Plants, animals, and fungi. They're all made of cells. All of those cells are eukaryotic cells. They all have a nucleus. They all have a rough and smooth ER. They all have all those organelles we're used to talking about that we've learned since, literally middle school. All of them will have, like we said, organelles made of membrane. The nucleus has a wrapper that goes around it. The mitochondria, it's the powerhouse of the cell. It has literally two wrappers, an inner wrapper and an outer wrapper. We'll talk about those. The rough and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the rough and the smooth ER, they're made of membrane. So eukaryotic cells have organelles made of membrane. I do want to take a pause for just a second and go back to prokaryotes. We say they don't have organelles, but they do have arguably a couple of organelles. They have a thing called a ribosome, which we'll talk about much later on. Ribosomes are an organelle that aren't made of membrane. They're not made of wrapper. All right? They're not made of tissue, basically. Prokaryotes do have ribosomes. They do have what we call a cytoskeleton. They do have internal scaffolding, internal structure. But short definition, prokaryotes don't have organelles. Eukaryotes do. This is a picture showing a prokaryote versus a eukaryote. We've already said that prokaryotes are smaller. Here's my bacterial cell. This is a prokaryotic cell. This is my eukaryotic cell. All right? This big blue thing in the center, that's the nucleus. All of these different dots that we see around, these are all the different organelles. We do see a blue smudge in the center of my bacterium. That is not the nucleus, but it is its DNA. The DNA of a bacterium stays stuck together in a clump. Our DNA is held within this structure called the nucleus that has a wrapper around it. It's kind of like a water balloon full of DNA, whereas their DNA is just stuck together in a clump like a bunch of silly string all packed up together. That's really what the eukaryotic cell is. The prokaryotic DNA. It's like just imagine a bunch of silly string. It's all been mashed and packed together.